All right, so let's get right to your decode segment. Lots of great points made in response to what happened this week in the Capitol. Take it away, Nando.
Yeah, I was trying to come up with a topic for my decode. I was in the chat. I was asking for ideas. I was trying to desperately to talk about anything other than the thing that happened, but I just couldn't help myself. You know what I'm talking about, that thing that happened.
USA! 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 Stop the violence!
Yeah. A band of several thousand deranged Trump loyalists stormed the Capitol building and occupied it for several hours at the behest of several of the country's political leaders, like Josh Hawley and, of course, Trump himself, and with tacit complicity of the police, all playing out on live TV. And I have to admit that while it was going on, I was in a state of kind of paralyzed shock. I mean, how is one supposed to react to something like that? But as time wore on, and a couple of days went by, I was reminded of a quote by Karl Marx himself from the 18th Brumaire. Quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." And it's absolutely true. The QAnon shaman did make his own history when he stood inside the Senate chamber, but he did not make it as he pleased. He is a product of the circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. And as I think about what happened on Wednesday in the literal halls of power of our nation's capital, I can't help but think that it was the only logical endpoint to the Trump era, an era dominated by the man himself, an era in which his very peculiar brand of reaction and a politics of permanent conflict, which only served to distract us from the ongoing social collapse we've been living through since at least 2008 financial crisis. Trump was able to harness the frustrations and anger, but never able to turn them into real political action or policy. It was just getting people mad all the time for the sake of nothing. I mean, it's worth remembering that for all his bluster, the Trump administration and his Republican enablers, which controlled all three branches of government, managed to pass just one major piece of legislation, a grotesque tax cut for the already very wealthy. But despite that relative inaction in terms of major policy, we've lived through 4 years of anxiety-inducing permaconflict, which in retrospect was necessary for a right that needed to sell its unpopular agenda to its base. Whereas Reagan had the moral majority and the religious right to sell his politics of upward economic redistribution, Trump had QAnon and Pepe Means and owning the libs to sell his. And to the extent that Trump felt new and unique, and in many ways he was, it was in the way that that famous line in The Leopard had it. Quote, "Everything must change so that everything must remain the same." Trump came and went, and the same rich assholes got richer, and the poor got poorer. But what to make of the events of this week? Well, the difference between the left position on Trump and the liberal position on Trump has always been that the left sees Trump as a symptom of a broader systemic malaise, whereas liberals see Trump as the cause of all our problems. Witness the way liberals have rehabilitated the reputation of one George W. Bush, a man they absolutely loathed when I went to see a bunch of old rockers at the Vote for Change tour in 2004. And the reaction to the storming of the Capitol broadly tacked along a similar line. I don't think anyone can say that this is, quote, normal, but I think that we on the left see this as a continuation of something and hopefully the logical endpoint of something that is much deeper. The liberal response, on the other hand, has been to flex their authoritarian instinct, i.e. the people involved should be found and prosecuted, our Silicon Valley overlords should manage our democracy by banning the presidents of the United States, which they did. And the implications of that decision will be far-reaching and reverberate for years. Obviously, there is catharsis for liberals in seeing the president they hate banned from his favorite social media platforms. But the precedent is an important one, and we should ask ourselves whether we want to give this power to unelected billionaires, to ban our elected leaders from what is a de facto public square controlled by private megacorporations. And last but not least, liberals are looking to pass a new Patriot Act to deal with quote-unquote domestic terrorism, which President-elect Joe Biden has already promised to do. Here is the Wall Street Journal reporting, quote, Mr. Biden has said he plans to make a priority of passing a law against domestic terrorism, and he's been urged to create a White House post overseeing the fight against ideologically inspired violent extremists and increasing funding to combat them. And we know how that's going to go. Evan Greer, writing in Fast Company, reminds us that, quote, expanding the U.S. government's already bloated surveillance state will only bring more terror and harm to the same communities that Trump targeted with his racist policies and rhetoric. More money, weapons, and technology in the hands of the Department of Homeland Security, an agency complicit in human rights abuses long before Trump took office, won't stop the rising threat of right-wing violence. Instead, it will be used to suppress legitimate dissent and disproportionately target Black and brown activists, Muslims, immigrant communities, and social movements that effectively challenge systemic injustice and corporate power. We know this because we lived through 9/11, which was a horrific act only compounded by our response to it. A global war on terror abroad that has killed millions, and a radical expansion of the surveillance state at home, all costing trillions of dollars. So where do we go from here? Well, I think it's safe to say that despite fears to the contrary, Joe Biden will be inaugurated on January 20th, and the Democrats will take their majority in the House and Senate. In other words, Trumpism was defeated after 4 years in power. So what will happen to the Republican Party now that it has unleashed these dark forces amongst their base that are loyal to Trump as a person rather than any specific policy or party, and are clearly spinning out of the control of someone like Mitch McConnell or Lindsey Graham, who was berated by a group of Trump supporters at the airport yesterday?
We are not going to touch you. We will not touch you. We're not going to touch
Yeah, you love to see it. So Corey Robin has been making the point for years that despite the fact that the Republicans controlled all three branches of government, it was actually remarkably weak, the Republican Party, especially compared to its years of ascendance in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. That's probably true. And hopefully its turn towards Trump and his cult of personality will leave it even weaker than it was now that he's gone. I mean, will Josh Hawley be able to rouse the same passionate support that Trump was able to? I'm skeptical. And what about our good friends, the Democrats? Well, now they are in power, but not exactly in a commanding position. They were able to retake the Senate, largely by promising the voters of Georgia that if they sent Ossoff and Warnock to Washington, they would immediately pass $2,000 checks. But Joe Manchin, the Democratic senator from West Virginia, has already thrown cold water on that idea. It may still pass, but it's not guaranteed by any means, despite the fact that Biden, Schumer, and Pelosi are all on record saying they will get it done. The backlash, should they fail to do it, could be devastating. But the immediate task of the Democrats is to not fuck up the distribution of the vaccine. No small task in a country with almost no public health infrastructure and rotting institutions after decades of neoliberalism. And if liberal bay Andrew Cuomo is any indication, their head is just not in the right place.
You know, this vaccine can be like gold to some people. And if there's any fraud in the distribution, you're letting people get ahead of other people or friends or family, or they're selling the vaccine, you'll lose a license. But I do believe it should be criminal, and I'm going to propose a law to that effect.
Listen, I get it. It's annoying that certain people will skip the line, but the top priority should be to maximize the amount of people vaccinated as quickly as possible. Right now, we're way behind schedule on that front, and it's not time to be precious about means testing the vaccine rollout. The quicker, the better. The more volume, the better. But beyond that, the Democrats' challenge will be to repair a society that is utterly broken, as we've seen from the events of this past week. Biden's response to the crisis was a speech so filled with empty platitudes that it barely registered. And in terms of policy, there are some decent things on the agenda, from an expansion of infrastructure, spending, and some climate stuff. But ultimately, the task of fixing America's rotten political order will come to the working class. Will there be an organized workers' movement that will challenge the balance of power away from corporate dominance? History has taught us that whenever there has been any reform that has benefited the mass of workers, it has come as a result of pressure from below, from an organized and militant working class. Progressive outcomes are connected to the class power of working people because they're what keeps society chugging along. If we just try to appeal to politicians' morals, a combination of their specific donors and their general requirements to keep corporate profits in the green will nearly always take priority. The only way we've successfully gotten politicians to pass legislation that benefits working people is when working people have had the collective power to threaten corporate profits. We can only outpressure the economic elites on our politicians if we challenge our boss's ability to make profit. To steal a line from Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, especially in regard to Democrats not really being up to the challenge of the moment that we're experiencing right now. Joe Biden was even against, just the procedural resources that Democrats have at their fingertips to hold Trump accountable, whether it's doing an impeachment investigation, whatever it is. I mean, think about it. This is a guy who has, even though he's been, banned from Twitter and social media, he's still a person who has a tremendous amount of power, a tremendous amount of access to things that are incredibly dangerous, like the nuclear codes. There have been stories about him potentially doing some sort of military strike against Iran in order to scare Americans into and persuading Americans into keeping him in power. I mean, all sorts of terrifying things that I hope don't actually come to fruition, which is the reasoning behind people who want to get him out of office as soon as possible. I don't even know how to process everything that's been going on, which is why I want to have like a lengthier discussion about the events that unfolded at the Capitol. As I was writing my Decode segment today, I wanted to focus specifically on power building. And, Nando, you recommended Robert Caro's books. I've been obsessed with them ever since you recommended them. And just learning about legislative power and how to wield it has been helpful. And I'm going to save that Decode segment for next week.